Okay, welcome everyone. We're glad to have you here for our Southwest Agroforestry Action Network event that is being presented today by David Bainbridge. I'm going to turn it over now to Andy Mason to kick us off and get started. So Andy, you are welcome to take the helm.
Thank you, Bev, and good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Andy Mason. I'm the Secretary for the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network, also known as SWAN. We're doing this in partnership with Arizona Community Tree Council and the great Zoom hosting help of Bev Babb. So thanks, Bev. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker, David Bainbridge. I've gotten to know David a little bit over the last few months. I think I should have known him earlier in my agroforestry and forestry career, but I've gotten to know David now. He lives in San Diego. He's a restoration ecologist. He's a historian, an author, and much more. And his interest in agroforestry has been there for many years, dating at least back to an agroforestry exchange program he did in China in 1989. And I'm going to just share a few. Do I have permission again, Bev? It looks like I do. So I'm going to share. Do you see the slide now before you? So I'm going to share a few slides about David. I think that's a good way to introduce him. So this is back in 1981. He was looking for a more sustainable future for arid lands. The trail was not easy. David, like many of us, was introduced to Aldo Leopold a long time ago. He got a degree in ecology, decided to make a career in land restoration. I think he wanted to do a career in agroforestry, but there really, still to this day, there's not a lot of jobs specifically in agroforestry. He studied oaks and native land management, looked at acorns and oaks in California in particular. Back into academia, he worked in the Mojave Desert as an ecologist, and then eventually, I think for many years, with the Drylands Research Institute. And as I mentioned, he was on a trip to look at agroforestry in China in 1989, and David has already offered to me that he could give a presentation about that experience for us. So I hope we can get that one arranged for one of our quarterly webinars. He worked with the San Diego State University Restoration Group. Here's some work with tools, soil penetrometer, etc. Soil preparation, we all know, is extremely important for growing any plants, and sometimes ripping is necessary to reduce compaction. Areas of focus, water, root growth. I think you're going to see some of that today in the Mesquite presentation. Of course, irrigation. So important, and particularly here in the Southwest. At least it is, depending on the plants that you want to grow. I think I have this book. I haven't mentioned it to David, but I think it's on my bookshelf, and I did not. Now I know the author of this book. Plant propagation. Just David has been involved in a lot of different things, and also has written some books, some history books that I don't believe have any connection to agroforestry. So it just shows you what a diverse person that David is. So with that, I am going to turn this over to David for his presentation, Mesquite, a multi-purpose tree crop for agroforestry in the Southwest. So Bev, you're gonna, or is David gonna share his screen?
I hope to share my screen. We're getting there. Excellent, we made it. Well, welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about Mesquite. and it's many purposes, mostly in the Southwest, but I'll mention some other options in places around the world where it's used. And I have to say, most of my experience has been in California, which is a very different climate. We deal with like 3 inches of rain in many of the places I work, not the rainforest like you have out in Tucson and Phoenix. So it's a little different question. But one of the things I like about mesquite, and you can see it in this picture, is the pods are in hand-sized groups. And I wonder if that wasn't a question of selection over the years for people grabbing the mesquite that way. The many purposes most of you would already know about, but food, wood, charcoal, honey, alcohol, you may not be so familiar with that, and smoke wood, and then a wide variety of services, windbreak, shade, dust control, and many others. And are you seeing the sidebar? I'm not sure we get rid of that or not.
No sidebar, it looks great.
Oh, okay, great. So what are the mesquites? Well, there are reportedly 45 species of mesquite around the world. And in many places, it's a critical resource for native people, as it was here. Here we can see some pods and acorns, which I've really spent more time with than mesquite pods, since I'm unfortunately allergic to all legumes. It can also be a difficult pest, and that's one of the questions that's often raised, is how do you deal with mesquite in a way that doesn't lead to problems? Mesquites provide food, fuelwood, medicine, and fertilizer for native people, and we're starting to realize that there may be some real opportunities there. I started work in the low desert in California, and here we did some deep root studies using a drill and getting down to more than 6 meters. And it was a real challenge doing sterilization between samples so we could look at the rhizobial counts. And we found that most of the nitrogen fixation was taking place at 4 to 6 meters. For a long time, people thought mesquite didn't fix nitrogen because the nodules weren't found near the surface. The deep root bacteria fix nitrogen, which is really important for desert ecosystems, which are often nitrogen limited. One of the other things that they do is they can form mesquite mounds, known as nebkas in other parts of the world. The compound leaves of the mesquite are excellent for slowing the wind and capturing sand and dust. And one of the things we did was we got a job to try to recreate nebkas. I did a lot of work on root growth. It's critical for mesquite, and we know that they grow very fast. Early studies by Dr. Cannon found they could grow up to 5 centimeters in 12 hours at high temperatures. So I did a lot of deep digging. This particular plant was 1.5 years old, and I went down to 6 feet before I lost the taproot. I also discovered rummaging in the soil for so long, you can get coccidioidomycosis, the fungal lung disease known as valley fever in California, but widespread throughout the Southwest and down into Mexico. And I would not recommend it for anyone. They have to grow fast because the seeds are scarified in floods. Almost all the seedling growth we saw in California came after major flood events, which chips the seeds and moistens the soil. The roots have to grow fast enough to keep up with the soil dry down. As the moisture level drops, the roots have to go deep. And they have very different partitioning than many trees. The root shoot ratio is often 5 to 1 instead of 1 to 5. And mesquite roots have been found at 46 meters, so about 175 feet. More commonly, they're at 20 or 30 feet in places with groundwater. Learning about the taproots changed our approach to planting, and we moved to taller and taller containers as time went by, starting out with pipe sections and other homemade items. But today I'd be more inclined to use the Stewie & Sons deep pot. They have 4 by 30 and now 5 by 40. And not easy to handle, a challenge sometimes to plant, but really good for growth in arid environments. And NAUs is using some of these in Arizona. And the advantage of these tall pipes is tall pots is they can be used for a deep pipe irrigation after the plant is put in. One of the challenges is how do you get water to these deep roots? And one of the things that's looked appropriate is wick irrigation. That uses either gravity or capillary flow through a wick, nylon or polyester wick. And it can stretch limited water supplies for days to weeks and sometimes months. They've independently rediscovered by other people as well in both Australia and the commercial water box, which comes out of the Netherlands of all places. And the little diagram here is from Australia. It uses a just simple black plastic to make a little reservoir with a weed mat cover and the wick going down where the seedling will be planted, and very successful and very low cost. The water boxes have worked well in places where it rains and might work well in Arizona, but they're fairly expensive. So here's the water box, and this is an acacia in Africa. And you can see in the bottom right corner the little nylon wick coming out of the reservoir. And that'll move water out slowly but steadily for quite a long time. Unknown questions still are how do roots grow so deep? Obviously, studies of roots are very difficult, even more difficult than looking at what's at the bottom of the ocean. It's very expensive to dig, it's very expensive to wash things out, but it could be helpful to know more about how these deep roots grow. And the little chart here shows some of our tests on wicks. One of the things we might use them for is to tie the mesquite roots into the groundwater. Water will rise through the capillary openings in wicks, and for some of the materials, the wick will wet up to almost 50 centimeters. So if you have a wick from the surface and a wick coming up from groundwater, you might be able to connect roots to the deep water. And the nebkas are very important ecologically. They have obviously food, shelter, place for moist sand that animals can dig dens in. Very good for biodiversity. They fix nitrogen, they add organic matter, and they can grow fairly quickly. This is 12 years of growth on a nebka mound recreation. And the many uses and products are almost unlimited. Some you're familiar with: honey, alcohol, hardwood, fuel wood, charcoal, smoke wood, are all commercial to some extent. The use of the pods in alcohol and food is increasing, and mesquite is being considered more and more often for landscaping, both native and selected imports. Most people prefer thornless. Plant breeding is also continuing to get trees with straighter trunks and no thorns. And Peter Felker has been working on this for the last more than 30 years. So, surprise, alcohol. The native people made alcohol with the mesquite pods, high sugar content. There's enough sugar that it doesn't have to be malted like grains do. And in places you can buy mesquite beer and vodka, and they're not totally made with mesquite sugars, but they certainly are included. And you can see they're both from Texas. It's a lot more fun sometimes to harvest your own pods and process them as a group. Here we have the Desert Harvesters in one of their entertaining events down in Tucson. Brad Lancaster and others have helped make this community process work. On the other side, we have Casa de Mesquite, Peter Felker's company, bringing in mesquite bean flour from Argentina, where they found that labor was cheap enough to do it well. If you haven't collected pods, you should give it a try sometime. They should be dry enough to snap. You want to taste them before you harvest many. They vary quite a bit in flavor. And the local tribal people and traditionally would have known all the trees and which ones were sweetest and which ones tasted best. Just like we know the restaurants and cafes around where we live, they understood the trees as well. I was out with a Zuni elder one time, and he was able to tell me which trees were the best trees for the juniper berries. We want to dry the mesquite pods as much as possible and to mill the pods when humidity is low to keep them super dry. If the pods aren't really dry, they can really make a mess of a hammer mill. As you caramelize the sugar, it really gets very hard to clean. And to store the flour carefully. We had a student at UC Riverside doing his doctoral dissertation on mesquite pods. And he was from Switzerland, from one of the big industrial food families. And he did really the first really good test of commercialization of mesquite flour. The moist pods we know can grow fungi that make aflatoxins, which aren't good for people or animals. It's most common if pods are on the ground, if they have beetle holes, and if they get moist. So in California, it's rarely a problem because we don't get rain in the summer very often, and we don't get rain in the spring. And lately, it looks like we're never going to get rain. But you want to keep the pods as dry as possible. Aflatoxin is also a risk on other nuts and stored grains. And Dr. Sadhana Ravishankar at the University of Arizona has kindly offered to test samples for aflatoxin, which he's been doing. Mesquite honey is really well known, and very many artisanal producers of mesquite honey of various kinds. To get pure mesquite honey, you have to have a good drought, so nothing else grows. And most commonly, what they call mesquite honey is still a blend of different pollens. Here in California, we have an opportunity to do it more often because we don't have those spring rains, and it's not uncommon to have pods on the trees or flowers on the trees and no flowers on the ground. Hardwood is wonderful. Hard, it's been used for many purposes, including paving streets. Super hard for durability, low shrinkage, lovely color, but it's very challenging to mill from all this crooked shapes of the branches. It has to be dried down very carefully before use or it'll twist. And it needs to be protected from insects in storage because it can bring in some pests that will chew holes in it. Most commonly used for custom furniture and sculpture these days, but more opportunities do exist. Most valuable market for mesquite today is probably charcoal, and millions of dollars are spent for premium charcoal for barbecue shops, grills, pizzeria places. Much of it's imported from Mexico, or was until COVID, and others are made in the Southwest. So superb fuel wood can bring up to $400 a cord if it's well prepared. Value-added products are really one of the great opportunities for mesquite right now, and small companies are giving it a go with places like the Bean Tree Farm and mesquite bean farms, chili sauces, barbecue rubs, all sorts of different things you can see in the picture. You can make mesquite molasses. It's being used in some pancake mixes with the flour, non-alcoholic drinks, chutneys, jams, jellies, and then a wide variety of lotions, soaps, scrubs, and salves. And this is another one that really opportunity is great for improved use of mesquite in medicine. Folklore and tribal memory report a wide range of uses for everything, every part of the tree, the pods, the gums, and the leaves. It's antibiotic, astringent, anti-parasite, antifungal, anti-inflammatory, really just a medicine chest growing in the backyard. There are also reports of use for control of lice, pain, rheumatism. One of the most common issues has been treatment for eyes, heartburn, ear infections. And recent research is finally looking at why this might be true. There's a range of phytochemicals in the pods, alkaloids and flavones and things that really do have medicinal uses. The question is, which of the traditional remedies are real and which ones are placebos. The pods come in all sorts of colors and shapes. This is one of the more unusual ones here, the Prosopis kuntzii, which is from Argentina, and South America is the place where the mesquites most likely came from. Another opportunity is carbon sequestration. Obviously, if you have a root at 175 feet, it's not going to be turning over very quickly. The deep roots can lock carbon away. Peter Felker estimated up to 6.6 megagrams per hectare were possible with just a 25% canopy cover. So the invasive mesquites in Texas obviously causing problems for ranchers, but they are sequestering carbon. And there's a chance maybe carbon sequestration payment could help pay for improvement of rangeland and farmland. One of the most beneficial uses could well be the use of mesquite for windbreak and dust control. If you look at the chart here, it's the fatalities and injuries for Arizona natural hazards. And dust storms are responsible for really the most injuries and a pretty high number of fatalities. And if we could look at the cost of these different hazards, the dust storms would certainly probably come out on top. The particulate matter are very bad for lungs, asthma, COPD, the valley fever, all have fairly high costs associated with long-term care. There are all the traffic accidents, fender benders caused by dust, and quite a bit of property damage. Even worse problems out here in California, we have the Salton Sea drying up, and we're going to have tons and tons of toxic dust being carried into the air and into places where people live. We also have in California as much as 500,000 acres that will be abandoned in the San Joaquin Valley soon, farmland. California passed the law on sustainability of groundwater a couple years ago, and it's going to take enormous amounts of acreage out of production. Mesquite can grow really quickly under good conditions. This is the Coachella Valley, a little stretch of windbreak along one of the freeways. And these were planted as small seedlings from pine cells. And within 5 years, it was a really substantial hedge. It was only irrigated the first year, and that was done just with a few gallons for each tree. Good for repeated harvest. You can coppice mesquite, go through and mow it down basically almost to the ground, and it'll sprout back up. It can be grown in blocks, it can be grown in rows, and really provide quite a bit of firewood while it's also providing honey and other products. Trees on the rangeland can be a problem, but they also are an opportunity for shade and protection for animals, shelter from the sun and wind. This big bull is down in Texas under a mesquite getting a little shade. It can provide better grass and forbs near the trees because of the nitrogen production and moisture saving. And when things get scarce, animals can eat the pods. Also the opportunity for minor income from wood, beans, and other honey and other things. Good windbreaks for crops. And one of the advantages for these trees is if they do deep root, you can get them to groundwater, they have very little interaction with surface crops. And they traditionally provided nitrogen for the native crops in the Tohono O'odham and other groups, and it still could work today. Around the world, there are a variety of different systems using mesquite. The silvopastoral system is goats and mesquite trees in India. Mesquite is still a very important tree in parts of Rajasthan for not only for animals, but for people as well. They eat the pods just like the people did here. And as you may know, if you've ever dealt with goats, there's a reason these trees don't have any branches on them low down, because if they did, the goats would be up in the trees eating the forage. And there's some amazing pictures of trees full of goats chomping down on the fodder. Mesquite for animal use, obviously used by many wild animals. In our projects, we had just a terrible trouble with jackrabbits. They love the seedlings. And we had to go to very severe protection measures to keep them from getting eaten. They were used in the early days in the desert as food for horses when there was no other food available. And you can still find lines of mesquite trees along some of the old stage routes. They are eaten by livestock, but they certainly have an aflatoxin risk as well. And something that early reports always blamed on the pods probably was more likely the aflatoxin. The protein digestibility is pretty good, and in parts of Mexico, the pods are ground and fed as a standard livestock feed. And when things get desperate, animals will also eat the mesquite leaves, but it's really a last resort. One of the projects I worked on was the selenium remediation in the Central Valley. We did some samples from our Harper's Well mesquites and found that they had a very high level of selenium. So we thought we could use the mesquite trees to pick up selenium from the soil and then cart the pods over to the Sierras, where we have areas with super low selenium levels and selenium deficiency in deer and elk, other animals. So you could have a win-win solution. It was a little too complicated for people to really get behind, but it could be done. Something to be a concern in other places too is to look for levels of arsenic and selenium in the pods. Many places they could be used for groundwater management. We don't have so many problems like this, but we do have some in the Coachella Valley where the groundwater has come up to the surface or close to it, creating these salt and alkali barrens. And screwbeam mesquite will grow in pretty high salinity, so it could help draw down the groundwater. In Australia, they've had a number of groundwater control programs, starting with one for a $1 million tree program. And they were able to get the groundwater down low enough to break the salt scab problem. Drain water from agriculture can also be used to irrigate windbreaks and coppices for fuel for some of the mesquites, which are pretty salt tolerant. For erosion control, it's hard to beat some of the work that the local people do in northern Sonora, using branches of willow and cottonwood placed along the riverbank to grow these hedges, which restrict flood flow and help retain nutrients in the fields. And in many cases, the mesquite thorn branches are woven in and out of the trees to limit livestock movement and also to capture more of the nutrients. And it's called the abono del rio, the fertilizer of the river. So one of the opportunities that presents itself for all these thorny branches is using them as hedgerows, using the branches for seedling protection instead of introduced protection. Once they were used by the Tohono O'odham for field borders and flood management, nutrient capture, and animal control. Everyone should read Gary Napan's thesis, and his many articles on this are really important and useful to look at. And now I'd like to share some of the challenges that we face. Finding money for research on native foods and a wide range, not just mesquite. How do you process them? How do you commercialize them? We need some agroforestry field trials. And there's some very interesting work that's being done now. The National Science Program has a program that looks at human and natural systems coupled together. And they just issued a really excellent book on the acequia management in New Mexico, of how irrigation was managed traditionally and how that's continued in many places. They found there might be still as many as 640 sequoias in use in New Mexico. So funding that couples the science with the cultural practices is really urgently needed. And until recently, that was just something that wasn't going to get funded. Agroforestry field trials in just a wide range of places could make sense and could add to our knowledge of how to better manage mesquite. Better selection of mesquite cultivars, food, fodder, timber, how to get those into the market. Peter Felker now has a patented mesquite, which grows a straight trunk. And we can expect to see more of those appearing. Restoration farms are another possibility of something that could be done. Take the worst land and see what you could do with it. Show how traditional and modern irrigation and crop selection could provide an opportunity for people even in the most difficult conditions. Great opportunities for medicine, and that will require molecular studies, in vivo, in vitro studies. These are expensive, but they really could pay off because the antibacterial, antifungal properties are something we're always looking for as other ones become captive to the thing they're supposed to control. A lot more could be done with cooperative marketing and processing systems for mesquite products to help the small producers. Often somebody may want to produce mesquite flour, but they don't want to be a mesquite flour salesperson. So you can get people who will aggregate crops and cooperate and sell them together. And places to consider for demonstrations. There's certainly plenty of opportunities in Arizona and New Mexico and Texas, places where the poverty rate is 30% plus. What do you do? How do you do it? One of the most important things is to have a long-term research cycle of 10 or 20 years. Traditionally, most of the academic funding is for 2 or 3 years. And if you're looking at trees, that's simply not enough to do much good. One of the best studies of nutrient effects on the environment was done in England, and it continued for more than 100 years. And it provided really important information that couldn't have been found really any other way. Academic programs are increasing. Agroforestry still just a small slice of the pie, but I hope to see much more of it in the future. There's a need for both the research and then hands-on skill training on how to manage mesquite, pruning, planting, how to do everything that could add value to the mesquite crops. And then we could really use some foundation support for agroforestry competition. And I'll explain a little bit more about that with one of the following slides. So global opportunities, food, fodder, wood, fuel, medicine can really improve the quality of life. Permanent agriculture in the most difficult sites. It's well adapted for climate change as things get drier and hotter. Mesquite could be more useful. And we need a great deal more work across the borderlands between the US and Mexico. The earth care work that Gary Napan has started is really encouraging. The problem is mesquite can be very invasive. If it's in a place where it doesn't belong or as a symptom of mismanagement. And here we have a picture of Prosopis juliflora eating a road in Ethiopia. And some of these julifloras have spikes or spines that are 4 to 5 inches long. So they're very difficult to deal with. In this area, the mesquite was planted by the warlords, and they weren't obviously very good ecologists, and they didn't appreciate what they were doing. There was ongoing fighting for several years, so there was no management of the agricultural fields, and the mesquite got loose and just took off. Very difficult to manage. One of the issues that people have pointed out, though, is places where it's become invasive. Quite often the local people don't know how to use the pods, and they're not aware of the opportunities for making honey. So there's a good deal of work that can be done on education to help people use these areas that have been invaded by Prosopis. Mobilizing people, always a challenge. And the Pani Foundation in India came up with a great idea, which has brought great results in different parts of India. They did a competition called the Water Cup competition, which was really a rainwater management program at heart. And they offered some prizes, and leading villages would get more support for additional projects. So more than 1,000 villages across India participated in this rainwater harvesting program. Here's an example. Here in the US, of course, we do all this with bulldozers, but it can be done with people as well. And you can see they're making pretty good progress on terrace swales and berms. The winner and others found that they saved enough water and moved enough water into the groundwater that they no longer had to buy water during the dry season. And I'd like to acknowledge all of my students, volunteers, and colleagues for putting up with me for many years and adding to our understanding of mesquite. Peter Felker was at UC Riverside when I was there and did an amazing trial of different mesquites to see about growth rates. That's where I got to see the 5-inch long spikes. And he continues to work hard on mesquite at the Casa de Mesquite. Gary Navan, of course, is renowned throughout the Southwest for his work with mesquite and other native crops. Ken Rogers is the Texas Mesquitero. I got the chance to spend time with Richard Felger out in the field, and unfortunately passed away. And at the moment, Brad Lancaster and his rainwater harvesting in Tucson is doing a remarkable job. Dr. Ross Virginia at Dartmouth was my companion and co-conspirator on research at UC Riverside, and really helped bring into the focus the deep root growth and ecosystems of the deep roots. It's not just the roots there, but there are nematodes, bacteria, fungi, and they all make a difference. And then J. Russell Smith inspired many of us, including Andy, as it turned out, with his book of tree crops, which was written many years ago. And one of the most remarkable characters was Valerie Havard. He's a physician, army officer, and ethnobotanist. And in 1880, he wrote an article called The Mesquite, spelled a little bit differently than we do it today. And he really captured almost all of what I've said today, or at least much of it, remarkably well in 1884. So lessons have been out there. We just have to get to them. So many resources. Gary's recent book, An Arboreal Love Affair with Mesquite, is a little off and on, but it's fascinating. The Magnificent Mesquite by Ken Rogers, it really does a nice job of covering it all. And you can look at a couple of my books for more on irrigation systems and container planting and some of the work we've done with mesquite. And I put up a special little bulletin on deep roots on my Works BE Press site, which you can take a look at as well. So let us not forget the acorns. That's really what I started with. Mesquite's a sideline. And I've got a couple of bulletins out. The Acorns as Food is the most downloaded paper on my one of my websites. And the use of acorns in California is still worth pursuing. South Korea currently uses 45 million kilograms a year of acorn flour. And much of it is hand gathered, just like it would be gathered in the US by the native people. And you can see here we've got acorn liqueur as well, and some acorn cookies from Kia in Greece. And that's it for me. I'm happy to get to our questions on chat. And with a little help, maybe I can get my picture up on the board as well.
All right, David, if you want to unshare the screen, it'll go back to the full group. There you go.
All right. Now, how do I get myself up there, do you suppose?
Yep.
Yeah,
And
so Bev, yeah, this is Andy. I can put these questions to David that are in the chat box if you like.
that sounds great. Go ahead.
Okay. First, David, thank you. That was great. My eyes have been opened even wider about mesquites for sure. So I may even ask a question at the end here, but let me get to the chat box here. And I have one from Patricia Carroll. As a homeowner, if, when, and how should we irrigate mesquite? Any tips on the care of backyard mesquites are appreciated.
All right. Backyard mesquites can be a challenge because the roots are so aggressive. If there's any sewer lines nearby, they're likely to find them. So the irrigation might be designed to keep it away from anything valuable like the sewer lines. Our mesquite are so tough that we can get by for years without much irrigation. But if you want them to look good, you need to water off and on at least. And most of my work has been with deep watering because you can get more use out of the water if you do that. So we use what are called deep pipes, maybe 12 to 14 inch, 2-inch diameter plastic pipes. And we'll run the water into those until the ground is saturated, and then not irrigate again for 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay, next question, David, is from Chris Coates. What is the possibility of growing mesquite at the far end of their zone? I live in zone 6B with some snow around 5,500 feet elevation.
Good question. I don't know. It's not something I've dealt with, but I've certainly seen mesquite in the snow. So I would suspect they could survive at least occasional chilling it down to pretty low temperatures. And that probably would be velvet mesquite, I would guess. But Prosopis glandulosa, the honey mesquite, is more of a low desert, I think.
Well, and Gary Nabhan has something here. It's probably more of a comment, and I'll paraphrase some of it. David's excellent emphasis on existing markets for fine hardwoods, honey, flour, molasses, and fermented products allows opportunities to create mesquite artisan training centers along the U.S.-Mexico border as part of a Green New Deal or border Earth Care Youth Corps. Ironically, we lack producers, not demand. These ideas are being advanced to the Biden-Harris transition team as we speak. And then Gary provides his contact information. Those of you can go in your chat box and you can get Gary's email there. And he also mentions the Mesquite Manifesto, which David, you're aware of. And then he talks about fire roasted mesquite flour from, I don't know how to pronounce this, SERI, S-E-R-I, Indian communities.
Right.
For 12 years and 6 outlets in Tucson, plus Museum of the American Indian in DC, and honored on the Slow Food International Arc of Taste. They use chili roasters to toast the pods for 2 minutes per half kilo batch.
Excellent. Not there, except mesquiteros know their stuff. So definitely take a look at what Gary's been doing.
Yeah, and I believe we have Gary confirmed for our SWAN webinar in July. So that'll be great to hear from Gary there. So here's from Jean Lewis. Do mesquites that are grown in the home landscape from nursery containers grow as deep roots as you indicated in your talk? Do they have more lateral roots close to the surface to access infrequent rain?
Yeah, they're more likely to have the shallow roots, and it's really a matter of production in part. We said the root shoot ratio of mesquite in the native situation may be 5 root to 1 shoot, and landscape nurseries are trying to do exactly the opposite. They want to have a big bush with almost no roots because it's easier to handle in the nursery. So you might have a gallon pot with a fairly large shrub, and if you turn it upside down, that's what the roots would look like in the shoots for a native plant. So it's possible to reduce the taproot domination. If the ground isn't water deep, I think you'd have shallow roots more likely.
Well, and I have a comment here, great program from Mark Kopecki, and I agree with Mark. From Eva Stricker, what is the potential for use for biochar with mesquite?
Oh, I'm not familiar with what they were doing with biochar, but it makes excellent charcoal. So I would assume it would be good.
And then a question about, are we able to get a recording of this outstanding presentation? Yes, Bev is recording it, and with all, as is the case with all SWAN webinars, you can go to our website and view it and listen to the presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, from John Hentz, one of the slides showed that nitrogen fixation occurs very deeply in the mesquite root system. Is that nitrogen readily available for use by nearby plants with shallower roots?
Yes, it gets mobilized to the surface by the leaf fall. So the leaves are fairly high nitrogen, and so are the twigs. So as they go to the ground, they bring the nitrogen up to the use for other plants. And that's how the Tohono O'odham used it. They had little weirs that would catch the flood debris, and the flood debris was very high in nitrogen, partly because of the leaves and twigs from the mesquite.
Another comment, great class, David, from Anthony Luciano, always looking for more education. From Rich Strait, a very eye-opening presentation on so many related issues. I agree. From Carrie Ann Campbell, thank you, David. You are my dryland restoration hero. I have learned so much from your books. From Bill Hart, he says, you mentioned the historical issue in Texas with mesquite. How does a landscape program avoid invasive trend?
Always a good question. In general, invasions represent symptoms, not causes. So something's been done wrong or inadvertently led to the mesquite invasion. Overgrazing, changes in the soil chemistry from grazing, introduced exotic grasses. I have a problem with that in California from nitrogen deposition. Leads to fires, which kills native plants, which leads to opportunities for invasives to come in. Really, the most appropriate thing is to use the plants that are from your area. In Africa, one of the biggest problems has been the introduction of inappropriate mesquite. The Juliflora has been just a terrible problem in Africa. And if we go to India, we can look at Prosopis cineraria, which is very non-invasive, and yet it still has many of the properties we would see in our honey mesquite, still widely used in India for food and fodder. So it's being very careful about what the ecological niche is of the plants or insects or animals you're working with, and trying to figure out more clearly what could go wrong, and make sure you do the best you can before you get started.
Great. More thank yous. A reminder, and Steve Price will talk about this. We have a silvopasture listening sessions coming up that will be announced here in a bit. From Olivia Diaz, for planting a small community urban garden in Phoenix, what species of mesquite would be best to plant for food, and where in the garden would you recommend it be planted?
Well, it depends how big the garden is, but I would put it on the north end of the garden, I think, so you still get enough sun for the garden. And to try and really deep water it so you don't get the roots out into the garden beds. I've had a garden at school, and the eucalyptus roots were able to make it more than 50 feet from the tree over to the school garden. So every year we'd have to clean out the eucalyptus roots every spring before we got our bed set up. So mesquite certainly has the same potential.
Yeah, that's
One of
exactly
the things
what.
I meant to mention and I forgot during the talk was the idea of coming up with some better harvesting systems for mesquite trees, and I really would like to see a whole tree harvester. Peter Felker did a little work on that, but he didn't have enough money to make a big enough machine to really make a difference. So the idea would be to have a hydro axe, which is a monster blade for clearing brush, on some sort of a movable arm so you could clear out invasive mesquite, but also have it combined. So you got the wood, the twigs, the leaves in ways that could be commercialized. So it'd be $1 million machine, but it might be worth it.
I've got one more. If we're still doing well on time here, if folks have any other questions for David, put them in the chat box. Here's one, David, from Heather Ellison. Where does the nitrogen that the deep roots are fixing come from? Is there still air in the soil pore spaces that deep down? Thanks for a great presentation.
Well, that's a good question. The nitrogen actually would be moved to the soil from the air. There is air in the soil, and some would be probably carried in by the water as well. But it's a good question. Not totally sure about the answer.
From Katie Armstrong, do you have any recommendations for pruning?
Yes, I've had good luck with pruning, and just try to shape the tree for something that will be good for what you're looking for. If it's shade, if it's easy access to pick pods, prune away. It won't bother the trees. They can tolerate really heavy abuse, and they also can tolerate wildfire pretty well. They'll come back very quickly after wildfire.
Okay, I've got a question, David, because I don't see any more in the chat box. I have a group of mule deer that come through my yard regularly. I live in Carefree, just north of Scottsdale. And in the summer, they will clean the mesquite pods off the ground in my yard, which I'm not sure I can do much about, but they seem to be attracted to them. Is there any issue, do you know about, of this aflatoxin with mule deer?
No, it's a good question. It really is something that I haven't seen much talked about. Even the concern about aflatoxin for people is relatively recent. And I don't know if anyone I haven't seen anything, that's probably somebody who's looked at it, but I'm not familiar with it, of what it would do for not only deer, but for cattle, goats, anyone that's picking the pods up off the ground certainly could be affected by the aflatoxin.
Okay, we got more questions coming in. This is from Mick O'Neill. People in the Pacific Northwest are experimenting with a harvest/chipper with hybrid poplar. This could be considered for mesquite?
I would think so. It'll probably have to be beefed up. Poplar's pretty easy to chop up, and mesquite not so easy, but it could be done. If you haven't ever looked at it, take a look at hydro axe brush clearing. They're pretty amazing machines. We had used one on one of our mine reclamation projects, and it was pretty amazing what it could do in terms of composting material.
And from Jesus Garcia, how about efforts to air layer good varieties of our region, and when is the best time of year for that?
Good question. I don't know. I've never tried the air layer, but I would suspect it's something you'd start in spring. Most of the growth, at least out here, is taking place in March, April, May. And then we've got our pods by May, and mature by late May or June. So I try air layering January, maybe, see what happens.
Peggy Sorensen says, Olivia Diaz asked what species would be best for food. I have found the velvet and honey mesquite to be best, far better than non-native varieties. What do you think?
That's been my experience as well. But as I said, in recent years, I've developed an allergy to all legumes. So I haven't munched on any pods in a long time. But both velvet and honey mesquites are quite variable. And that's one of the things you really need to do is sample quite a few to decide which trees have the best pods. They really can be very sweet and very pleasant, and some will be not so delectable. Same problem with acorns. They're highly variable in taste as well.
Okay, that is what I have for questions, unless there's any last questions folks would like to put in the chat box. Okay, so Bev, I'll just move us to the next part of the agenda.
And thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Very, very, very much. That was great. I learned a great deal, and I know others have. We have really good turnout for this webinar, and it's just super. So thank you, and just a pleasure to have met you, and to now have you be a part of SWAN as well. So next, I'm going to move us, and I hope many of you will stay for this. Next, we're going to move to our SWAN business meeting. And the first thing I want to do before introducing our new chair, Steve Price, is I don't think he's on, he might be, but Jim Allen has been the chair of SWAN since the beginning, which is now getting to be almost 2 years since that first meeting in Farmington, New Mexico. I think it was spring of 2019. Some of you were there. And also to thank Ann Audrey for her service as vice chair during that same period. So this is great. SWAN continues to survive and I would say thrive. And so Steve Price, who is with Utah State University Extension, has stepped up and he is our chair of SWAN now, and Donna Davis is our vice chair, and Donna is with Colorado State Forest Service. So you can kind of see we're kind of rotating around the states a bit too. So Steve, if you can be unmuted, I'm going to turn this over to Steve Price, our new chair.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. Thanks everyone for sticking around. That was an awesome presentation. I wish I could grow mesquite in my area. Maybe we can. We just got to try something different. So first on the agenda here, we have an upcoming silvopasture listening session. So silvopasture, for those that might not be familiar, is the intentional combination of perennial management, tree management, along with livestock management. And actually, David had mentioned a silvopastoral system with goats and mesquite in his presentation. In the chat, I'm going to put up the registration link. So on January 28th and February 11th, we'll be having those listening sessions. Everyone is invited. We'll have a presentation by Maurice Robinette. Maurice is a rancher in eastern Washington, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about some of the different holistic management techniques he's been using on his land. He's been grazing kind of post-fire, and he'll be telling us a little bit also about the ponderosa management he has. So that'll be on the 28th, January 28th. February 11th, we'll have Arnold Clifford, who is a Navajo geobotanist, who he's had a wealth of experience across the southwestern U.S. looking at different plant utilization, he's authored a few different books. So we're excited to have his kind of his take on some of the openings or possibilities out there in silvopastoral systems, specifically geared towards the southwestern US. As Andy had said, we also have, I guess, are there any questions about the silvopasture listening sessions?
Yeah, Steve, hey, I think Arnold, I think he's going to be with Maurice on the first session, January 28th.
Oh, okay.
And then
Right.
Hugh Fitzsimmons is going to be our lead speaker from Texas on February 11th. Mick
That's
is on
right.
here. If I think that's the way. I think I've got that right.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
We moved two, so there will be two presentations.
Yep.
On January 28th and then February 11th. We'll have two.
That is correct.
Yep.
We'll so if you can join, please join both. We've left some additional time, February 11th, to kind of get some more discussion happening. So if there's anyone out there in particular that's working with producers that have an interest in silvopasture, help us spread the word. We really want to get a producer perspective on and helping us kind of understand some of the questions we have. So it's kind of a two-part program.
Can I ask a quick question?
You bet.
So I'm really excited about this session. One question I had was whether it'd be helpful or not helpful to try and invite some other folks from sort of Intermountain West, sort of dry side regions outside of the Southwest. Or are we really trying to keep the discussion to sort of the Southwest itself?
So when we were kind of initially putting this together, we were trying to focus on the Southwest, but we've had a difficult time finding many producers that we've been able to identify. So that's one reason we invited Maurice. He's Eastern Washington, so very arid, similar to what most of us are dealing with in the Southwest. So yeah, we for sure can use some other Western arid producer input. If you know
Great.
someone, definitely let us know.
Great, thanks.
Okay, guess moving on. So we have our quarterly webinars, similar to what we've done today. Our next one is April 13th, and we have Jerome Ostanowski from Colorado, who will be telling us a little bit about the group that he's worked with and some of his operation there in Basalt, I think is the place that he's at. And then July 13th, if you enjoyed today's program, we'll actually have Gary Nabhan joining us in July. So similar work to some of the stuff that David's done.
Gary has confirmed it will be a presentation about the survey that he did in the southern Arizona area, but it covers other parts of the desert Southwest. And it will be about looking at all sorts of different food crops potential for the area, not just concentrated on mesquite.
Yeah, so Gary is he's authored a handful of different books on ethnobotany. So I'm really looking forward to it. That should be a good one. So those are our next upcoming quarterly webinars. If you haven't signed up, if you sign up for the SWAN on the SWAN mailing list, you'll get an automatic get an email about those as a reminder. In 2022, spring of 2022, we are looking to host our next in-person conference. Unfortunately, 2020s, we had to cancel last minute. And Audrey did a lot to help put that on, get it lined up for us in Tucson. But we will be in Moab, Utah in 2022. So in particular, if we have any folks from Utah that have a vested interest in providing some input, definitely let us know. And Bev, could you give me a share screen permission?
You bet, Steve. You've got it.
Okay, there we go. The last thing we wanted to talk about on the agenda, see if I've got the right thing here. So some may have noticed on the SWAN website, there's been a what is agroforestry video. So if we have a minute, we can watch that.
The term agroforestry is derived from agriculture and forestry and represents a combination of both. Through the integration of trees on farmland, increased social, economic, and environmental benefits are realized. There are three main classifications of agroforestry systems. The first, silvo-arable, includes trees with crops. The second, silvopastoral, includes trees with animals. And the third, agro-silvopastoral system, gathers trees, crops, and animals together. In conventional agriculture, removing trees is a common practice. This principally affects hills and valleys, leading to severe erosion. Trees on farmlands can have a variety of positive effects on both crops and animals. As their roots extend much deeper than those of annual crops or pasture, water can more easily infiltrate into the ground, which leads to reduced waterlogging and runoff. As a result, erosion rates are significantly reduced. Trees also take up nutrients in deeper layers that cannot be reached by the crops, and thereby prevent the leakage of fertilizers or manure into the groundwater. The canopies of the trees serve as windbreaks, which lower the evaporation of the surrounding vegetation and act as a shelter for increased animal welfare. The inclusion of trees in agriculture enhances biodiversity and helps with biological pest control by attracting birds that feed on caterpillars, for instance. Trees can diversify a farmer's income sources. They can provide fodder for livestock, food such as fruit and nuts, firewood and timber. In contrast to annual crops, trees in general have a much slower rate of income return. They may take several years before they start paying off. This is a big obstacle, especially for farmers that do not own land, but only rent it. Agricultural policies often discourage farmers from adopting agroforestry systems by not providing any subsidies, while conventional monoculture systems are promoted. Forest regulations might even prohibit the cutting or selling of tree products grown on farmland. Although not as profitable as conventional agriculture at a first glance, agroforestry comes with long-term benefits, such as preserving forests, cleaner waterbeds, healthy biodiversity, and a sustainable and profitable relationship between the farmer and the environment.
All right. Stop share. So it's kind of a interesting introduction to agroforestry, and hold on, now everything's there we go. So an interesting introduction to agroforestry, and one thing that was mentioned in the last exec committee meeting was we wanted to see if we could actually produce something similar that could be shared on the SWAN website that is maybe a little bit more contextualized to the southwestern US. Something that has, maybe it looks a little bit more similar to the sort of systems we're working with. Maybe we could actually put real world examples of what we see in our area. So we just kind of wanted to kick it out to the group, I guess, and see if there is anybody with interest in helping produce something like that. One thing as SWAN was kind of coming together, one task we kind of wanted to, or goal that we had, was to produce something that's educational that we can also use for outreach to increase adoption, which is our overarching goal. So I don't know if the best way to structure that conversation, but I guess if folks have interest, or maybe a good way to do it is see if there are some of you working in agroforestry systems, maybe you have demo projects, maybe you actually are a producer. Certainly we could make use of some high quality video or pictures from your operation that we could use in producing a video that's, again, giving a good introduction, but contextualized within the southwestern US. So,
Steve, this is Beverly. Is this a project that we're going to be submitting for any grant funding to provide the production value? I understand that our group here will provide the expertise and some images. What's your thinking on funding for the higher production value?
Yeah, that could be something that could be done. One that comes to mind would potentially be like WSARE actually has a producer professional grant that comes out, and actually just ended in November. So that could be something that we could look at as a group. I don't know, where I'm an extension, most of the grants that I work on, they're really geared towards research and on the ground education. But I would think that there would be someone out there that would want to put forth some funds to do electronic education, maybe help us. There's a few other things we've talked about getting on the website.
Well,
yeah, Steve, that program you mentioned, you mentioned the acronym, but this is Department of Agriculture's Sustainable Agriculture Research and Extension Grants. Isn't that right, SARE? And
Yeah.
there's a Western SARE that we could apply to. And in fact, Kate McFarland and others know this. there are other regional agroforestry groups that have gotten grants from SARE for things like agroforestry academies. So it is an opportunity to advance what we're doing with SWAN.
Maybe, Steve, if we scoped out the project, we could then take it from there and see what we could do to get some funding for it, so we could produce something really professional and engaging. And once we've got that, we can reach out to our community for the types of images that we might want to add in, as well as maybe form a task force to participate in the content creation.
Yeah, I like that. That's probably the best way to tackle it. It is a little bit of a, it's not a super easy project. And we might even think about, you know, the kind of different practices if we think that there's, you know, the project could be easily expanded to have some specialty videos and all on the different practices we talk about in agroforestry. So yeah, I'm certainly interested in doing that.
Okay.
It'd be nice to hear from folks what their comments are on that video, which I believe is European. It may have been developed by the European Agroforestry Federation. I'm not sure, I didn't look at the credits, but I believe it's European
I think so.
in origin. But what do folks think about, you know, a video like that, or just that one in particular?
Well, I thought it was very interesting and easy for people of all ages to understand.
Oh, thanks, Sam.
Yeah, this is Corey. I really liked it too. I haven't seen anything like that covering, you know, mildly complicated subjects that really spoke to, you know, it could speak to a lot of audiences. So I really liked it. And I think it would be a great companion piece to anything that was a little bit more technical. You know, if there are products like that out there that already exist, no reason for us to do that level, but maybe if we're going to create a different kind of a video, we could do a different level. But yeah, I thought it was really well done. I enjoyed watching that.
I agree. Well, maybe Beverly, for a scoping, a working group task force, what's the best way to kind of co-organize to have an initial scoping meeting?
Well, let me put some parameters around it and then send it out to the SWAN community. I have the people who've signed up for this event, as well as people that are on our mailing list, and ask people who wants to be involved, and we'll set a meeting and start looking at the basic scope, and then say what are the goals that we're trying to achieve and what are we going to do. So I can take that and move that forward to that point, and then we'll take it from there, and that will let us also go out to funders, because we'll know a little bit better about what we're doing and how much that might cost.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And Beverly, if you want to include Lorianne Barnett on your ideas for scoping, she's just really expert at this kind of outreach product. So if you're looking for a partner or a helper on this at this stage, I think she would be great. And I don't know if she's on this call, but if she's not, she's going to get volunteered. And if she is, maybe she can weigh in and say if she's interested, but I think she'd be amazing at helping with this kind of thing.
All right, fantastic, Corey. I'll make sure she's included and in the loop.
Okay.
That's great. Okay. I believe unless there's any additional topics from the group that we need to discuss.
No, the only thing, Steve, I'd add, this is Andy, is if folks are interested in getting continuing education credits through Agronomy Society of America or Society of American Foresters, I think you need to put that in the chat box.
That's right.
Yep, and actually, for the education credits, there was a form that we'd ask people to submit their credits on the event registration. I do have an entire registration list, so I'll compare those two across for the education form and the registration list, and should be able to make sure that we get that out to the right people.
Great, thanks, Bev.
Okay.
All right.
Andy, this is Sadie.
Yes, hi, Sadie.
Regarding outreach and education, you might also look into Richard Straight's program. I had a chat with him yesterday, and it sounds like his program has money for outreach and education through partnership. So that might be something you could look into.
Yes, Sadie, thank you. And I think Kate is on from the National Agroforestry Center, and I think Rich was earlier, if they have anything to add.
Yeah, Rich had to get on another meeting, but we could probably have a conversation about that. That could be a good conversation to check in about. We're trying to sort through the limited funding we have this year and figure it out. So happy to talk more.
Thanks, Kate.
All right, do we have anything else for the good of the order before we hit the 10:30 mark?
No, thanks everybody for joining us, for sure.
All right. Well, thank you all for being a part of this. I will post the recording up to the website later today and send out notice to everyone who attended the event. We at our top had 91 people on our event today, so well attended. And a big shout out to David for doing an excellent program for us. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Bev.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.